Welcome to the Wisconsin Podcast. I'm Craig Sauer. On this podcast, we talk Wisconsin things, everything from media, sports, culture, nature, politics, and more. This week, I talk with Buddy Huffaker, the executive director of the Aldo Leopold Foundation, named after the famed conservationist who did some of his most famous work in Wisconsin. Leopold is considered by many to be the father of wildlife ecology and the United States wilderness system. He was a forester, philosopher, and writer. He wrote the book, The Sand County Almanac.
Leopold really is one of Wisconsin's kind of iconic figures. Sometimes we take that for granted or don't even know, but, Sand County Almanac was one of the top 100 books of the 20th century, and he continues to be looked to as a kind of giant in articulating and defining how and why we should take care of the earth.
The Aldo Leopold Foundation was established in 1982 by Leopold's 5 children and his wife Estella, with the mission to inspire an ethical relationship between people and nature through Leopold's legacy. Huffaker started at the foundation as an intern 2 decades ago and never left. We talk about what it's like to work at the foundation, Aldo Leopold's life, and why the conservationist remains so relevant still today. So I think most Wisconsinites have heard of like Aldo Leopold before. Some have maybe read his, famous book. Could you maybe flesh out who he was as a person and maybe put his life into perspective a little bit?
Yeah, I think you're right, Craig. Most people would know Aldo Leopold as the author of A Sand County Almanac, and that's why he's really still a prominent figure in American history, in particular in environmental conservation circles. In that book, he puts forth this idea of a land ethic where people have an ethical responsibility to think about the natural world and how we take care of it, and it in turn takes care of us. But that was the culmination of a lifelong journey and exploration and engagement with the natural world. He was also one of our first professionally trained foresters. He graduated from the 5th graduating class of the Yale School of Forestry, which was the only program of its kind at that point in our country's history, and then worked for the Forest Service for several decades before getting transferred to Madison, Wisconsin, and getting really interested in wildlife, leaving his secure government job to do private contracting, wildlife management studies, which would lead him to write a book called Game Management in 1933. And then 2 years later to get hired by the university to hire the first course in game management, wildlife ecology ever offered in the United States. So he was always kind of on the leading edge of conservation thought and ecology, and it has just become kind of this icon for the conservation movement, largely through his book, A Sand County Almanac, which has been translated into 15 different languages now and sold millions of copies.
So we're recording this in Baraboo today. Why did Baraboo, this place, become the place where his foundation is now? Like, why are we here? Why are we recording here?
Yeah, great question. Well, in 1935, Leopold was looking for a piece of property in Wisconsin, close drive from Madison, so he could take his kids out to engage the natural world, something he did as a child and really cared about. And really through a happenstance, a realtor friend pointed out this property outside of Baraboo along the Wisconsin River, cheap at that point, just back taxes because the landowner had gone bankrupt, associated with kind of the Dust Bowl era of failed farms. And so he purchased the property. They started planting pine trees and hardwood trees and prairies. And it was really that experience that inspired him to write A Sand County Almanac. So where we sit now is just a mile down the road from the property he purchased in 1935, which is now a National Historic Landmark. So it's been recognized as one of our country's most important historic sites. And we're here because this is where he passed away in 1948. So he was up with his wife and youngest child, Estella, over spring break, and a brush fire escaped the farmstead that was standing in this spot, and they came down to help suppress it, and he suffered a heart attack and passed away. So that's the connection to Baraboo. It's basically the location of his farm and then where he met his untimely death.
Also on the property is the shack, his famous shack.
Yep.
Can you tell me a little bit about that? And if people were to go see it, what would it look like? What's kind of the whole aesthetic of the shack?
Yeah, it's very low key. So the shack has become kind of the icon for his idea of living in touch with nature, living lightly on the land, this land ethic. But it's really not much of anything. It was the only structure standing when they purchased the property. They had to add a little bunk wing onto it. And it really was functioning as a livestock building when they purchased it. So when they first encountered it and their father had told them that they bought this little cabin along the Wisconsin River, any ideas or visions of grandeur quickly dissipated when they opened the door and there's chicken and cow manure frozen waist deep in there. So they had to remove all that. They added some windows and doors that they got from the junkyard in Madison, add this little sleeping bunk, and that's what it is. I love the way his daughter Nina Leopold Bradley would describe it. It was kind of everything and nothing. And so it's very humble. It's just vernacular architecture, old barn boards clad the outside. And it was just a place that they could get out of the rain or the elements in between projects outside.
So how much time did they spend there versus maybe in Madison?
Well, this was always their weekend retreat. So they never actually lived there. But they would come up as many weekends as they could. At one point during World War II, they actually had to ration their gas because of gas rations associated with the war. And so they'd have to save up for a month to be able to come up here once during that time period. But otherwise, they would come up as many weekends as they could, which would be often multiple times in a month. And then the rule was when it got so cold that the toothpaste froze, then that's when they stopped coming up for the winter time.
And you got to know some of his kids, and I'm assuming you kind of talked to them about the experience of being in the shack and being up in this area. What were kind of some of the things that they said about that experience?
Yeah, I had the great good fortune to know 4 of the 5 kids. Estella Leopold, the youngest, is still living. She's still with us, 91, professor emeritus at the University of Washington in Seattle. But I think what is striking is just what an impact that experience had on all 5 of them. All 5 were scientists and conservationists. 3 are in the National Academy of Sciences. No other family has that many members in the National Academy. That doesn't even count their father. He didn't ever even qualify. And so they each had their story about being here and either hunting with their father or planting trees or walking in the woods and their father asking them about the plants that they were seeing. And it just clearly had a lifelong impact on them. And what they each went on to do for science and conservation is really impressive.
Yeah, it's remarkable that a family of that size, all of them would kind of go into a similar field. Do you have any sense why? I mean, usually there's got to be at least one outlier in the 5, right? I mean, that's usually how it works, right? But they were all kind of interesting.
It would be interesting to know what the dinner table conversation was. I never heard anything about them exploring other fields. The funny story about Estella, the youngest, is when she was trying to decide what to go to college for and what to study, she told her dad she wanted to be a bugologist, an entomologist. And he was like, well, what do you want to do that for? And she said, well, all the other fields are taken. Starker, the oldest son, he he's a wildlife biologist, and Luna studied rivers, and Nina was a geographer, and Carl was a botanist. So like Dad, bugs are the only thing left. And he laughed and then bought her a hand lens and a copy of Norman Fassett's Spring Flora and kind of guided her towards botany. And in fact, she did become a botanist. So that was the only outlier, was she was trying to find her own unique niche in the family. But yeah, it's really amazing that they all were that committed to it. And again, I think it was an expression of just how much it meant to them, and probably just must have been the energy and enthusiasm was contagious from their father, though he wasn't really an outgoing, bubbly personality. They must have just interpreted from him how important this was and how meaningful it was.
So fast forward a number of years, the family decides to start this foundation. What were some of the original idea of what they wanted to do, what the family wanted to do with this foundation?
Well, I think from the get-go, it was to continue to advance their father's idea of a land ethic, that people had an ethical responsibility to the health of the land. But somewhat interestingly, I think when they started it, it was just out of a recognition that people were still interested. So, he wrote this book. It got published a year after his death, so 1949. And it wasn't until the mid-'80s that they created the foundation. And so it was during that time where the children were off kind of pursuing their own lives and careers and would come back here. Their mother was still here and lived until the 70s. And I think it was just a recognition that the book was still selling. They would go places and to conferences, again, in the fields of conservation. People would be quoting their father or looking to that book for inspiration. People would keep showing up on the property. And I think it was just a recognition that, my gosh, we not only have an opportunity, we almost have an obligation to share these key assets, i.e. the property and the rights to his writing, with the rest of the world. And I always say it's a kind of remarkable act of generosity that they really decided to share their family's legacy and heritage with the rest of the world. And that's what they did. They created a foundation. They put those two assets, the writings and the property, into it. And while for many years they still had access and used the property and visited and those kind of things, they knew that they were giving up certain rights and had certain obligations then legally to share it with others, and did so with lots of gusto and enthusiasm. And I think it was just you asked what they wanted to see accomplished, and it was that people would continue to think like their father did and commit themselves to these values.
So was Leopold as well known in his lifetime as he is kind of now?
Yeah, great question. He was well known in the fields of forestry and wildlife. So in the professional community, among his peers, he was a leading seminal thinker. And he was president of the Ecological Society of America and president of the Society of American Foresters. And so people looked to him for leadership, but he wasn't a common household name like arguably he might be today in certain circles. And so what really happened was his book was popular among, again, the professional community. And then with the first Earth Day in 1970, so 20 plus years later, as the United States was kind of having this environmental awakening and people were looking for good writing and literature about the environment, he got discovered. And it kind of happened at the same time that Oxford University Press had worked with the family to bring out a kind of cheaper, mass-produced copy of a Sand County Almanac. And those things just kind of happened, again, by happenstance to kind of converge. And so all of a sudden, people were looking for literature. Leopold's book was more available and more affordable. And he kind of exploded, and book sales exploded after the first Earth Day.
What would you think Aldo Leopold would think about the building we're in now, like the whole foundation, the fact that his book sold so much? What do you think he would make of that?
From all accounts, he's a pretty humble individual. So I think he'd be kind of amazed and impressed. And it's still humbling for me to be here. And we have people literally come from all over the world to see the place that inspired his writing. And so to witness that is pretty humbling. In terms of the building, some of the neat features are that it's extremely green. So when we built it, we wanted it to be a model of what a land ethic could look like in the 21st century. So there's water efficient fixtures, efficient lighting, extremely efficient mechanical system, all the kind of common green building practices. But the most unique is that the structural skeleton of the building is built out of the trees that the family planted in the 30s and 40s. And so that's where I don't know what he would say, but I sure do like it when people come and say Aldo Leopold would be proud that he was able to start growing this building when he purchased the property in 1935. So it's a pretty neat and compelling story to be able to use, what Leopold was doing as the raw building materials for this facility.
What are some of the main activities of the foundation? What are some of the main things that you're trying to do or your goals?
Well, we continue to bring his book out into different languages and in different formats. So there's like a coffee table version now, that might help capture the just kind of moderately interested reader. We did a full-length documentary about Aldo Leopold called Green Fire, which is played on public television all across the country. The book is about ready to come out in a Brazilian Portuguese translation. It's been translated into Portuguese, but it was the European Portuguese. So, not a new language, but a new dialect, I guess, if you will. So those are some of the ways that we keep his legacy kind of out and in the fore. And then, continuing to manage the property and hosting people who come, again, from all over the world to see this place. And then not only the history of it, but we have placed the property in the context of an important bird area that is 16,000 acres. And so we manage our property with shared conservation goals as a private landowner family that's adjacent to us. The state, Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources has a 7,000 acre parcel. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has a 1,000 acre parcel. And so now we're doing kind of modern conservation across that 16,000 acres for land health, for wildlife habitat purposes, and primarily for habitat for grassland birds, which are really struggling across the upper Midwest right now. And so we're creating habitat for things like dick sissels and bobolinks and red-headed woodpeckers, and seeing success. So that's also really exciting. And then finally, one of our other conservation success stories is the sandhill crane. And when there were only 50 breeding pair at the time Leopold purchased the property in 35 across the whole state of Wisconsin, 50 breeding pair. Now the flyway population, so these are beyond birds that just breed in Wisconsin but move through, is 100,000. And in the fall of the year, along the river, we host about 15,000 at peak sandhill cranes that come to roost every night as part of their fall migration. So they do breed on our property as well, but the kind of more spectacular experiences is watching them come in the evening. So we started offering different viewing experiences for people who want a lot or a little about cranes. So that's been really fun. And then all of that is kind of made possible through our Future Leaders program, which is the newest facility that we just opened, again, built in the same style using local materials. And that's a program for people who have an environmental science degree and are looking to either go on to grad school or work in the field of conservation. They come spend a field season with us for 9 months typically and get to see all the seasons and get involved with all the educational work and the land stewardship work. So that's the kind of bundle of activities that you might run into here. You could, just past weekend, we were teaching people how to run chainsaws and do prescribed burning. In a couple of weeks, we'll do crane viewing. In between, we'll have a writing workshop. There's always something going on here.
That's great. Talking a little bit more about the leadership program that you run. How many people generally are up during a season, and at the end of the program? What do you want them to take away, or what do they normally say, was the highlight experience for them?
Yeah. Well, we have anywhere from 3 to 5. Kind of depends on what projects we have going on, how much funding we have. We'd like to continue to grow that. The facility has 9 rooms, so we got more capacity. Though we also have visiting fellows that come at different times that are at different stages in their career. But the traditional experience of a longer duration, we now have about 75 people who have gone through that program and are working all across the country. I think what they really enjoy most is just the chance to get to know a piece of land this intimately. I mean, you're out there at least 5 days a week. And then those that, and since we've been able to offer lodging on the property, spend their free time taking hikes in the woods in addition to when they're out there working on the property. Getting to just see that place that intimately over, multiple months and seasons, that laid against all these people coming to visit this special place and telling you regularly what a special place it is. I think that really our goal is that we're creating people, our alumni are committed to conservation for the rest of their life. That might be in terms of their vocation and maybe their avocation, that, they might not be working in conservation, but they're on a conservation organization's board or on the city council or, doing something to advance conservation. And I think we have a really high success rate. It's not quite 100%. There's a few people out there we know who've gone through the program that aren't, but we do a really good job of kind of cementing those values for people when they're here with us to go on and find their way to contribute to conservation.
You brought up the land ethic and idea that Leopold wrote about. Can you maybe explain how you approach that, how you view what that means, and just kind of explain maybe what it is or what it isn't?
So Leopold described the land ethic as simply enlarging the boundaries of our community, include the soils, plants, waters, air, and animals. And the way I kind of rephrase that is he was challenging us to recognize that we are a part of the biological community, not apart from it. And if we recognize that, then I think what he was saying is that is then why we're challenged to extend the same ethical considerations we do our friends and family to the flora and fauna. So if we recognize we have this connection, then we have to start thinking about what our responsibilities are to the natural world that we have this relationship with. So, and why Leopold thought that was important is he was seeing kind of social movements that recognize the concept of community and that we needed to take care of one another as humans. But he was really worried if we didn't extend that consideration to the land or to the air and water, that we wouldn't, in fact, have healthy human communities because we wouldn't have clean air, clean water, healthy food. So I think this concept that we're a part of the biological community, not apart from it, is, in a nutshell, kind of the easiest way I have to explain his land ethic.
I have a lot of friends who are hunters, so I have to I want to ask that question, which is I'm not, but was hunting an important part of Leopold's life and how he approached environmentalism? Yeah,
well, I'm always slightly amazed that people read Leopold in a Sand County Almanac and then are later surprised to find out he was a hunter, because so much of the book is actually his forays hunting and fishing. He just really kind of packages it in such eloquence and literary acumen that I think for those that, aren't kind of they're experiencing that with him, i.e. they don't hunt or fish themselves. They just kind of read the prose and envision themselves out in the field experiencing the natural world. But for Leopold, really, it was instrumental for him to hunt and fish. And that, in part, that's just because at a very early age, that's what he and his family did. He was introduced to all that by his father, who even imposed bag limits and hunting limits on and seasons on himself, even when that didn't exist in our regulations at that point. But throughout his life, Leopold would engage the natural world as a hunter and a fisher, and it was extremely important to him. The essay "Thinking Like a Mountain" talks about shooting a wolf. Red Legs Kicking talks about hunting ducks and the first time he shot a duck. And I think for those that do hunt, what they say, and I think we can see this true with Leopold too, is there's just an intensity in the engagement with the natural world when you are stalking prey in a way that if you're just hiking through the woods or kind of engaging it recreationally, you might not get. And so that is a kind of common conversation we're having now, especially as demographics change. I think there are many other ways to engage the natural world, but there are some consequences about the decline in hunting, both in terms of the economic engine to drive conservation. Ecologically, there's a lot of data that's showing white-tailed deer. The population is just going to get way out of control without hunting, which would be unhealthy for the deer as well as people. And then there is this just kind of individual, intimate connection with the land that hunting affords in a way that some other activities don't.
I know one thing hunters are trying to do is they're trying to get more young people to be engaged in hunting. And I imagine people who, just enjoy nature and outdoors stuff are doing the same thing. I'm wondering how you see that, or if you see fewer younger people coming out to the foundation or the property here, or what's kind of the state of young people getting outdoors?
Well, yeah, I think whether it's hunting, fishing, hiking, biking, even, I mean, there's so much screen time in our society today. Getting people to disconnect from technology and engage the natural world is really important. And there's a lot of people working on it. At the Leopold Foundation, we kind of look at high school, college, and above, and not that we don't think it's important. It's just where we think we can make the biggest difference. That's often when people are getting introduced to Sand County Almanac for the first time. And so we're trying to find ways that, again, that convergence of this might be in their course, or English professor might have given them this book to read, or environmental science professor. How do we create opportunities where they can then kind of build upon that? And so as an example, again, just this past weekend, we had a class from the University of Wisconsin up here. They're reading Leopold in a class, and we did a course for them on how to do prescribed burning. So they're a little bit interested, they're getting introduced. How do we kind of deepen that and give them some of the tools and knowledge to kind of navigate a way to spend more time outside? So really important issue for lots of organizations and issues these days. And unfortunately, no silver bullet. It's, we need a lot more good work on a lot of fronts there.
Do you remember the first time you read a Sand County Almanac?
Yeah, I was a sophomore or junior in college. It was a wildlife and ecology class at Purdue University, taught by Fred Montag. And I can kind of remember him. He would teach us about wildlife. And this was an elective. I was in, my academic background was in landscape architecture. I just heard good things about this course and this professor. So I thought, well, it kind of relates, kind of probably an easy credit. I'll just check that out. And I just remember him telling stories as he would teach us about wildlife. Then he would also talk about his life and lifestyle. And and not in a just kind of as a casual context for it. And I just remember then when we started reading his St. County Almanac, I was like, this guy is Aldo Leopold. I mean, I just was struck by how congruent that was. And the kind of funny part now is I really didn't think that much of the book. I mean, it was kind of interesting. I was more interested in my professor and his lifestyle and what was happening than the book. And, it made enough of impression on me. I kind of remembered it and knew that it was an important piece of literature, but it would be, I don't know, 5-6 years later before I stumbled upon Leopold again through an opportunity here with the foundation.
So I imagine you've gone back and read it again later on in life. Did you have a different perspective on it at a little bit older age?
Yeah, well, and in fact, I did like the later essays, the kind of more philosophical essays. Those were pretty interesting to me, even at that time. But I think it also probably reflected just where my whole mental and intellectual development was. Now I get a chance to read it, regularly, whether even passages or in its entirety at times. And one of the most impressive things about his writing is just how deep and layered it is. And you go back to it and you read it and you see something new, either in the writing or in how you're looking at the world. And so I think that's a testament to a lot of great literature, is that you can keep going back to it and you learn something new, you see something new, you feel something new. And that is a real testament, I think, to Leopold's just writing ability.
How would you describe how he writes or his style? You kind of just did. There's a lot of depth to it. But how do you like receive it? Like how would you describe his style to somebody who's never read anything that he's ever written?
Yeah. Well, one of the other reasons his writing stands up, I think, is that he was a professionally trained scientist. So there is really good scientific principles in his writing, and yet he uses none of that jargon. It is all kind of literary prose, lots of similes and analogies. And so he's comparing things. He's describing the mountain kind of with a personal characteristic. So he brings things to life in a way that I think we can all kind of relate to. And yet from a language perspective, it's almost like poetry, but in prose. And so it's very lyrical and it's melodic, I would say. I mean, one of the really fun things I've had the opportunity to do is the first weekend in March, all across the state, there are these gatherings called Leopold Weekend, and communities get together and they just start at the beginning and end at the end and read the book aloud. And you can read a paragraph or a chapter, and to hear people read it and just the quality of the writing and just how melodic it is really captivating. So that'd be something I'd also encourage people. We usually promote all the different events going on, and last year I think there were 30 different communities that did things, so you can find one in your neighborhood. But to hear somebody, it's great to read it, but to hear it read aloud actually is extremely evocative.
Is there a lesson in that, the way that he communicates lyrically, but also scientifically sound? Like, is there a lesson in that for you, in how you do outreach stuff with community? Like, do you see like kind of parallels to or lessons or things that you can take from that approach to what you do?
Well, I'd like to think we emulate and model his abilities and approach. A couple of examples. We do a lot of outreach and engagement with private woodland owners and trying to get them to understand more fully the opportunities they have to manage their properties for wildlife and other conservation values. And so we've done little handbooks, and it's all about ecology and ecosystems, and we don't ever use those terms. It's pretty basic language used in, more about communicating the intent and the message than than the jargon associated with it. So that writing is not designed to be quite as lyrical, and yet a little bit the same thing. And that's when you look at Leopold, he was just a great communicator. And so you can read his addresses to the Garden Club group, and he uses kind of one bundle of nomenclature and language. And then when he talks to the engineering class, he uses a little more kind of professional and technical language. And so he's just really good at kind of knowing who his audience was and meeting them where they are, sharing information, and then kind of challenging or asking them to go down the road with him. And a Sand County Almanac is that much more impressive because he's doing with the general audience. So, how to meet lots of people in kind of lots of different places and help them learn about the land and then think about what they might do to take care of it. So, yeah, again, I like to think that if you read our magazine or our web blogs, you might see some of that, but he's a high bar to reach.
So how did you become the guy that works here, from that kid who was in college who was like, I don't know about this book. How did you become, go from there to here?
Well, I'll spare you the whole journey, but in brief, I got interested kind of late in my undergraduate degree in kind of conservation and the environmental movement. But I finished my degree, worked for architectural engineering firm, realized that is not what I wanted to do. Explored graduate programs. Along the way, got pretty good at being a field botanist. And so I kind of made my way early in my career doing botanical surveys for organizations or companies or parks. And I kind of finally got tired of like just going someplace and identifying all the plants and then leaving, and somebody else would decide what was going to happen. So I was looking for opportunities to actually do ecological restoration or land management. And the International Crane Foundation, which is just about 5 miles down the road, had a program. And so I applied and I got rejected. Fortunately, it was right as Nina Leopold Bradley and her husband were ready for their second retirement. And so the Crane Foundation saw enough in my materials and knew they were looking for a field season assistant, sent my stuff down there. Still remember a beautiful interview at their kitchen table. And I got hired for a field season, and I did botanical studies, but I also got to do some management and help them. I'd planted a prairie for them and those kind of things. At the end, they liked me enough. They asked me to stick around for another season. And then that was also early on as the foundation was kind of growing, and they had a couple executive directors. The family was figuring out their role. There was a board, there were staff all of a sudden. So it was kind of a tumultuous time institutionally, but meanwhile, I was loving what I was doing. And at some point, it just became clear that maybe it made sense for me to become the executive director, and we hired a new field person. And so some days it would happen too early, but it's all been a pretty good ride.
Oh, that's great. So you've been here quite a while, and you've gotten to know this land pretty intimately, I would imagine, gotten to know his writing pretty intimately, Aldo Leopold's writing intimate. What do you make of the experience of living here and reading his work and just kind of being very immersed in all that he was?
Well, again, just a really humbling and such an honor to have had this experience. I think the more I'm here, again, just the more impressive his writing is, and how descriptive it is of the land and how one can engage it and witness it. And so, I'm just continually struck by reading October and then being out there and seeing the tamaracks turn smoky gold, and just you think, well, how would I describe that? And then you read his writing, like, well, yeah, that's exactly how I would describe it, and a lot better than I would be able to describe it. And so it's really just quite an experience. And then the other thing that, again, he never had the good fortune to experience and just didn't think was going to happen. I mean, his essay, Marshland Elegy, written about the wetlands right around here, it was an elegy. He thought sandhill cranes would go extinct. And now, this time of the year, to see thousands of birds fly overhead each evening and go to the river and hear them causing a ruckus out there. I mean, they're so loud. And just knowing that he never got to experience that, and yet wrote about them so lovingly and beautifully. That's another piece that really, this time of year, always stands out to me.
Is there something in particular, a phrase or something that he wrote about cranes that stands out in your mind when you think about that?
Well, I like what he described. See if I can remember it now. He said, he describes cranes and art, and he says, art begins with understanding and loving the beautiful, and then goes on to higher planes as yet undescribed by man. And so he uses cranes as this vehicle into the natural world, and that they were just so majestic and amazing that one could just kind of be captured by them. And then in doing so, you'd want to know more about, well, where do they live and why do they live and why are they not doing so well? And so I liked how he connected art and nature and, that in ways as yet undescribed by man, that some things are beyond even his eloquent pen, beyond describing. And then the other term he uses is the primordial bugling of the sandhill crane. And that, when you hear him, you're like, oh, yeah, that's what that is.
Tell me about that experience of being out by the river and seeing thousands upon thousands of cranes coming and going. Can you maybe just paint a picture for people who haven't done that? What what you see, what it kind of just feels like and smells like and sounds like?
So typically our experience is we try to get out there a half hour to the blind, a half hour before sunset. And that way, as the birds come in, you're not disrupting them. And then hopefully they'll land right in front of you. And when I say right in front of you, it may be 100 yards, it may be 10 yards, depending on water level and how many birds are there. But you can hear them off in the distance before you can even see them. And they come in right overhead, and then sometimes they'll bank. And again, whether it's 5 or 500 in a flight, they'll bank and then they'll circle around and they spread their wings and drop their legs, and they look like little parachutes coming down. And then they'll land on the sandbars and they'll kind of walk around a little bit, and then they'll start bugling and honking and squawking at each other. And then the next flight will come around. And just to kind of see them work, and again, the magic of the way they land is really spectacular. And then every once in a while, something will disturb them, and you'll get 100 or 1,000 birds get up and kind of move around, and you can literally just hear their wings beat. I mean, it's just, again, there are not many experiences in today's world to be that close to nature in that kind of way. And you could it's great when you're in the blind with a group of people and you hear a gasp, because it's just like, wow, that's so cool and special.
What is there anything else that we should talk about when it comes to the foundation? Other things that you got going on here?
No, I think just, again, this is the Wisconsin podcast program, right? I mean, just to stress that Leopold really is one of Wisconsin's kind of iconic figures. Sometimes we take that for granted or don't even know, but Sand County Almanac was one of the top 100 books of the 20th century, and he continues to be looked to as a kind of giant in articulating and defining how and why we should take care of the earth, and that he hailed from right here and kind of walked the same ground that so many of us do, I think is just an important thing to remember, and that is a strong Wisconsin legacy and heritage, that this state, Leopold wasn't unique. He happened to be a great writer, but lots of people in this state did and still do care about the outdoors. That's part of the reason we live here. It's a beautiful place to live. There are places to get outside, whether it's Kohler Andre State Park on the lakeshore or Devil's Lake or the North Woods, Madeline Island. We're really fortunate to have these national natural treasures. And that Leopold is part of that legacy. So remembering that, and then, selfishly to come see us then and see the place that inspired him to write this book that made him an American icon, because there's always something going on and something to do here. So I think those would be the two things, treasure our common heritage, pick up the book if you haven't read it and see what he's talking about, and then come see us to see it in person.
I was kind of curious as you were talking, he's an internationally known person. His writings are internationally known, but has his international stature grown over the years with the continuous publication of his book? I mean, is he known pretty well outside of the United States?
Well, I think, again, for those that work in conservation or environmental fields, yeah, he, John Muir, Henry David Thoreau, Rachel Carson, those, and Aldo Leopold, those would be the big names that people who learn about this movement or the history of conservation learn about. In other countries, he's well known in those fields. Probably in the United States, again, he's more a popular figure as a result of the book being a piece of literature more than these days than an environmental text. But yeah, I think if you went to a national park in another country, you may well see Aldo Leopold quote.
Is there one thing about Aldo Leopold that most people don't know that you want people to know?
Well, a couple things. He thought and wrote broadly. So a St. County Almanac is the key and seminal text. But there are other good writings by Aldo Leopold that folks could and should pick up. So it wasn't like he was a one-hit wonder. That was a great hit, but he has lots of other good writing. And I think the other is this notion that he was a private landowner. And so much of his legacy, rightfully so, is a result of his time working out in the Southwest, being a co-founder of the Wilderness Society, and suggesting we need these big blocks of land to protect wildlife and wilderness values. But he also became a very practical, pragmatic landowner who was just trying to do what he could to take care of a small piece of land. And so it also kind of empowers all of us, whether you own 400 acres or live in the city and have a little pollinator garden or grow vegetables for yourself hydroponically. He also kind of represents this individual who is just doing what he could where he had the opportunity, while still thinking bigger and more broadly about our relationship with the natural world. So I think that's something that sometimes gets lost. We think about him in these kind of big, broad strokes. And yet, at the end of the day, for him, it was all about, well, what can you do? How can you make a difference? And recognizing that we all have lots of ways we can make a difference.
Thank you to Buddy. I had a great time checking out the Foundation's building. They have some really cool offices. Get over there, get over to Baraboo, check it out. Make sure to subscribe to the Wisconsin Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play. You can also stay in the loop about the pod by visiting wispod.com and following the show on Twitter. @WisPodcast, and on Facebook @The Wisconsin Podcast. Cheers.